Sometimes just being able to faithfully reproduce a drawing on paper and then painting it in watercolor isn't enough. An artist willing to take the breakthrough should have a few more skills involving the understanding of contrast and edges control. In this video, I'll show you some tips on how to think like an artist. Let's take a look at my painting.
This is an angel statue. You know me, I love cemeteries, and painting statues is something I really love. This is not my first time drawing one. Let me show you some more studies I did in the past. These three angels are quick studies done with just a few colors. I'm that kind of artist who get lost in details, so sometimes I force myself to learn some looser techniques. This is another one. It's a bit more complex than the previous. It also has some details with gouache to make the foliage advance in the foreground. I loved this study so much that I wanted to do another one.
This class is fully uploaded on my Patreon and on Skillshare.
In this class, I'll cover tracing the reference. We'll take a look at the image, breaking it down to simple shapes that you can easily draw on your paper. How to make a grid and draw with the subject. Making a pencil value study. We'll decide which areas we want to highlight using contrast and edge control. And finally, the watercolor process, explained in depth, step by step. Despite that, there are still some things that I have to learn and improve. In this painting, I try to put into action the concept of contrast and edges control. Before even starting, I pointed out the sections I wanted to highlight. These were the head, the arm, and the upper part of the wing. Everything else had to be a step backwards. But how do you play with contrast and edge control? Let's begin with contrast. Contrast is all about creating major visual differences between multiple close elements. When there is a lot of contrast, our eyes are drawn to that part the most. Black and white is the most contrasting combination you can get. That's why we are doing a graphite study before we get started on the painting. That's why lately I started to make pencil tonal value studies of the painting I wanted to create. Also because a photo gives the same importance to every element in it. So faithfully copying it, you may end up giving importance to elements that just have a supporting role instead of a stirring part. This is my angel statue pencil study. It's immediately clear which parts I wanted to make advance and which one I wanted to make recede. Also, due to the low contrast in less important sections, I limited the amount of details in that area to not overwhelm the viewer's eye. Skipping to edges control. We have two types of edges, lost and found edges. Let me show you some found edges. They indicate a higher contrast, so the attention gets caught by them. On the opposite side, lost edges like this one are used to accompany the rest of the painting, just suggesting the presence of an element, helping resting the eye. To master these two elements is to make your paintings really stand out. To keep your painting's frame nice and white, you can use masking tape to mask the outside of your painting. I usually use wet on wet for the first glazes, which gives me soft edges and sets the basic tone of the area. I don't wet the entire surface, just the small areas I want to focus on. In this case, the head and neck, partially reaching the wing and dress, just to avoid hard edges and let the color fade naturally. You'll also notice that I didn't touch the left and upper section of hair, because we've already established in the graphite study a white hard edge there. I use a small round brush because I want to control the amount of pigment and water my brush can release onto the paper. With the small brush, control the dispersion of the pigment. My paint has milk consistency. Shade the eye socket. Drag the paint on the cheek. Then lift your brush on the lower part of the hair to let the bristles release water in the darkest area. Set the mid-tone in the behind wing. Now pick some paint of cream consistency and paint the darkest shadow. If your brush is releasing too much water, just dab the belly. The point of the brush will keep the pigment lowered. While the paint is still wet, I add a darker shade of color to the hair part. The brush has very little water in it. It's almost only pigment of cream consistency. It won't spread because it will need a lot of water to run. There's a very dark value in the neck. Paint under the chin with a very concentrated color. I used the darkest, most concentrated pigment I could pick to paint a shadow under the hair at the back of the neck. The color is almost black. Define a bit more the shadow that the hair is casting over the skin. Move around the pigment already on the paper, if your paper is still wet, to shape the shadows. Eyes are very tricky to paint in such small formats. Be sure to switch to your smaller brush and paint around the lids lit by sunlight. This technique is called negative painting. Now I'm shading the cheek with a tea consistency paint. Now I'm softening the edges with a clean brush. I love to use water brushes for details for their narrow and sharp tip, but sometimes their barrel just releases too much water, so I just get rid of it, using them just as regular brushes. I keep on building the shadows under the hair. The pencil marks are faint, but having done a study beforehand, I'm facilitated and know exactly where to lay those shadows. A loose painting works fine where strokes are confident. You can gain confidence by understanding your subject's volumes and lighting. In this part of the pencil study, we had high contrast. So I paint with a darker value the inner side of the hair. Be very careful because this will also shape the side of the face. This occlusion shadow is one of the darkest on this painting. My brush is holding a lot of creamy consistency of paint and the paper has a sheen on it. While the paper is still damp, I make long strokes to represent the folds of the skirt. What I like about using the spray to moist the paper is that it gives an uneven look, because some spots remains dry. I dab with the tip of my brush on some dark spots, but where the shadow is longer, I make some strokes. I keep on charging the shadow with more creamy paint. Remember, if you want your paint to stay put, make sure there's almost no water on your brush. This area must have a low contrast, so make sure to paint a soft graded wash that gets lighter towards the front of the skirt. I got my oval wash and paint water into the wing, leaving a stripe of paper dry where the sun hits the wing. Towards the bottom, I wet past the pencil line to avoid hard lines in this section. Let me show you the amount of water I have on the paper. Don't flood your paper with water. You want the pigment to soak into the paper instead of floating above the water. I got a bigger mop brush. This is Unico Infinito by Borciani e Bonazzi, number 0. I put an even coat of this granulating green, picking it up straight from the pan. I flick the tip of the brush to make the edges of the feathers onto the dry area. I painted the shadows before this coat to ensure I wouldn't lose the outlines of these feathers. Remember that the paint will dry much lighter than what it looks like when it's dry. In some sections, I regrouped some feathers just painting the outline. Here I'm extending the edge of the paint to make it feathered. I did it also on the upper edge of the skirt to soften the paint line. I got a darker green on my brush and dropped some paint besides the back. While the paper is still damp, I paint some of the feather's edges. I add some detail to the feather's edges and group some of them together to keep the wings from getting too busy. I feathered some edges to soften these hard lines. Then elongating the shadow to fill the underside of the skirt. So I clean my brush and feather the edge of the paint as I'm working wet on dry, just so that I can keep on charging this section with a deeper green. I linked all the other folds of this cone with this bigger shadow. This back stripe of dress looks flat. I give it more dimensionality, putting some more green. I used a flat wash brush to wet my surface. This type of brush can hold a lot of water because it mimics squirrel hair. I painted with a reasonable amount of water, paying attention to the statue edges. I didn't want the background paint to pass the edges. Now I pick up some of this paint called Nebula, and it's a granulating pink purple. So I painted a very watery wash because in this part I wanted the contrast to be minimal. If you want your paint to granulate a lot, you should put more water than normal, giving the time to the pigment to travel and disperse. Of course, don't make any puddles, or the pigment will just float above it uncontrollably. My paint is very watery at the moment. I'm working wet on wet. I've tilted the watercolor block to let gravity do its thing and make my paint flow and enhance the granulating effect, besides making a soft, even wash. I left the white of the paper to show through under the chin, because I wanted as much contrast as possible in here. Time to move to the other side of the sky. This time I decided to work wet on wet because the watery paint allows me to work it longer. I unintentionally painted a light graded wash and pushed the water on the lower part of the wing too, because I didn't want any harsh line in this area. Then I loaded my flat brush with Nebula and dropped it on the tilted surface, letting it flow down to the bottom. With the narrow side, I outlined the outside of the wing with very dark paint. I kept on pulling the paint, gradually adding more water in the brush to make a gradient. The bottom part needs to be lighter, but very softly and not with a dramatic shift of values. I pushed the pigment to pass the wing in order to make a seamless transition with low contrast and a lost edge. I switched to my Tintoretto again and dotted some nebula on the side of the wing and in the transition section. This edge was still too harsh, so I softened it a bit with the brush and the tissue. Don't wet the feathers too much, but just the outlines. Basically, I'm just lifting the excess of pigment accumulated on the edges. I wanted this line to be more feathered, so I wetted both sides of it and lifted it with a brush. The contrast wasn't on point yet, so I added a bit more of watery paint. The top of the wing had a darker line too, so I repeated the process to lighten it up too.
And that's all for today, guys. I hope that this chat about how to think like an artist was helpful. See you soon and happy painting! Let's take a look at
Che cosa vuoi sapere su Frank?
Sono cagata. I hope that this chat about how to think like an artist was helpful. See you soon and happy painting! Penso che va di bene.
Io penso di avere un topo vivo in cucina.
Oddio.